Hi, this is Dorie Clark. I am here with Francesca Gino, Harvard Business School professor and author of the book Rebel Talent. And today we are going to be talking about how you, quite possibly, can harness your rebel talent. Welcome to everyone who is here joining us live. Please feel free to type into the chat box and say who you are and where you're calling in from. And we want to hear from you. Francesca, welcome and so great to have you here.
Same here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Doris. So nice to see you.
Thank you. Well, this is part of our weekly interview show for Newsweek Better. And Francesca, the first question that comes to mind, and I'm sure this is top of mind for many people, rebel talent sounds like something pretty fun, pretty awesome, something that we might all like to be, but also aren't companies a little scared of the idea of hiring rebel talent? What do you mean by this, and how can we overcome the resistance that people and companies might feel about, what kind of people are we letting in the door here?
Part of the reason of writing the books was to say we need to shift our way of thinking about these rebels. The rebels, usually if we close our eyes and think about the rebels in our business, we think about the jerks, the show-offs, we think about people who are troublemakers, people who break rules just for the sake of breaking rules, or the contrarians. And what I wanted to say is that being rebellious can be constructive rather than destructive. And so I had the opportunity of shadowing, learning a lot from people who are rebellious in their unconventional way of thinking, but they're also quite constructive and they truly bring about positive change. And so I wanted to know what's their secret sauce, if you will, and how is it that I could embrace some of the same way of thinking. And I'll give you a quick example, since this one is one that inspired me to go on this journey. And it's the story of an Italian chef. His name is Chef Massimo Bottura. Is the person who owns a restaurant, Osteria Francescana, that in 2016 became the best restaurant in the world. It's a 3 Michelin star restaurant. And what the restaurant is all about is reinventing traditional Italian dishes. Now, if you know anything about Italians, that's a courageous act because we have all sorts of rules when it comes to cooking. We might not have lots of rules when it comes to speeding or parking legally, but when it comes to cooking, we have all these different rules about how to pair certain types of pasta with certain type of sauces. Is very complex and complicated. But you went into this context and started asking a lot of questions. Why is it that we cook this dish this way? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, but not today. And so it really brought curiosity into these traditional Italian dishes and came up with rather innovative recipes. And it was quite successful. So those are the type of rebels that I focused on, rebels who create positive change, and they come up with all sorts of innovative ideas.
That's fantastic, Francesca. Thank you very much. And a welcome to everyone who is here joining us. Please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you are calling in from. We want to hear from you. And of course, we are here on behalf of Newsweek with Francesca Gino, Harvard Business School professor. Now, Francesca, I am curious. You have actually taught a class, I believe. Tell me if this is right. You've taught a class called Anatomy of a Badass. This strikes me as certainly a form of rebel talent. What do you mean by a badass? And why are you teaching a Harvard Business School class about this?
One of the very fortunate aspects of being at Harvard Business School is having colleagues that I very much admired. And so a couple of years ago, there were discussions about launching a new course on inclusive leaderships. How is it that in all we do, we can truly leverage our differences and create inclusive environments? And the person who was thinking about teaching the class was my dear colleague, Frances Fry. And I reached out to her and said, look, some of the things that I've been working on with this book, with my thinking, are very much related to this topic. Can I join you in the effort? And so she was very generous. And so we jumped off the cliff together. That's how we described the experience. And one of the guests that we brought into our classroom in our first year of teaching inclusive leadership was Bose St. John, who's the chief marketing officer at Netflix currently. And she was talking to her students about this fierce urgency of now, how to be intentional in our choices. And what that also involved was bringing a lot of authenticity in what we do, which, as it turns out, is not something that we choose to do that often. And as it turns out, is one of the rebel talents that I talk about in the book. And so there were lots of synergies with her way of thinking, in the way we were teaching the class, and in my own writing. And so both Francis and I decided to launch a new program called, it's a short intensive program called The Anatomy of a Badass. And so it's all about figuring out how to have the courage to embrace who we are, because you've written about these topics as well. We often conform rather than standing out. We often go along rather than figuring out how to bring our best contributions forward. And so Bose refers to herself as a badass, and I would call her a rebel, but it was wonderful to come together and create this course.
That sounds so fantastic, Francesca. I love it. And a question came in. Thank you. Feel free, everyone, to type in your questions for Harvard Business School professor Francesca Gino. Nina had a question. She said, I love these Thursday talks. Thank you, Nina. She says, I have a question for Francesca. Are you, so you were the youngest woman, is this right? You were the youngest woman to achieve the rank of full professor at Harvard Business School. Way to go, you. And Nina wants to know, were you too a rebel talent? Can you explain? And if so, how did you manifest this in academia? Because everyone, there seems to be a bit of a reputation out there that academia is not the fastest moving or most flexible place in the world. So how did you navigate as a rebel, Francesca?
So it's interesting that I often say that you don't have to be born a rebel. And in fact, one of the beautiful aspects of working on this book and on these projects more generally is to help me realize the ways in which I was embracing these ideas and ways in which I was not, both in my professional life, but also as a parent, as a spouse, in my own personal life. And I started thinking about when I first landed in Boston, and I knew that I would be part of a school that cared a lot about teaching. And I thought that that was a great privilege to be in front of all sorts of students that then would graduate and have a really interesting journey. And one of the first things that I did, moment of vulnerability here, was to start taking speech therapy classes. Now, as you can probably tell, what a waste of money. But I took those classes for 9 months. And what I was trying to say is, how could I find my way to be more like them? That's just the opposite of being rebellious, of really embracing how I can be my unique self. And having an accent is a part of what I bring to the table. And so it's interesting to think about the fact that maybe initially my instinct was wrong, but part of what I believed allowed me to thrive and engage with my work more deeply and engage with my colleagues more deeply and have better relationship is embracing at least some of these ideas. I'm still on the journey, since I think a lot of what being rebellious is about is fighting our common tendencies of human being. We conform, we should be authentic. We take all sorts of usual ways of working for granted. We should be curious instead. So there is a lot of fighting, internal fighting, to bring out our rebel talent.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and thank you for sharing that, Francesca. That's really powerful. And I just want to say hi to some of the folks who are joining us here live. We have Joseph from Ireland. We have Elen. Nikos is here from Athens. Gregory from Rochester. Nicole is here from Silicon Valley. Amanda's tuning in from Boise. We have Lena from Denmark and Elena from Mexico. Oh my gosh, we have Barbara from Slovenia. Carlos from Colombia. So many wonderful friends. Welcome to everybody, and thanks for tuning in. You can put your questions for Francesca into the chat box, and we'd love to tackle them. And if you want to make sure that you never miss one of our weekly sessions, make sure that you start following me. Go to dorieclark.com/LinkedIn, and you can follow me there and sign up for my weekly LinkedIn newsletter so you can get alerted to these conversations. And of course, to learn more about Francesca, go to francescagino.com. So, Francesca, a big question that I think comes up a lot is, you were mentioning earlier that your definition of a rebel is someone who makes a productive difference, somebody who is constructive in terms of their difference inside an organization. But we all know and can probably think of examples where the rebelliousness has just crossed the line and gone a little too far into maybe a kind of toxic narcissism or something like that. How do we know if we're on this trajectory ourselves of being a rebel? How can we honestly evaluate for ourselves how much is the right amount and when we maybe have pushed the line too far?
I go back to this 5 talents that I identified in the work that I've done on rebels. And so we talked about authenticity, but there is also curiosity, there is novelty, there is perspective, and then there is diversity. And usually when rebels are taking things too far is because they're not keeping track of perspective. Perspective means that we come to problems, or we come to situations, and we fundamentally look at it from all sorts of different angles, rather than being stuck on one, which is generally our own view. And so what I often see when rebels take things too far, or they start becoming not that constructive anymore, is because they're frustrated that change isn't happening as fast as they would like to see it. And so, yes, there is a lot of curiosity. Yes, there is embracing novelty and authenticity, but they're not keeping perspective. And so their ideas, for example, in a meeting, come in as arrogant, rather than, I understand what's there, and let me suggest with respect a different way of looking at this and moving this forward. So that's probably where I would keep my attention, is, am I coming in with a broad perspective where I have this sense of wanting to learn? And despite the fact that you might have a lot of experience on, or be even the subject expert on the topic, you're humble enough to stay open with your mind and broaden your perspective.
Yeah, that's a really powerful test. I think that's helpful, Francesca. Thank you. And Anna had a question. She is curious about gender differences with regard to rebellion. Specifically, in certain cultures, it may be a little harder for women to get away with being rebellious. How do you think about that as obviously a woman yourself, someone who has studied this issue? What do you make of gender differences with regard to the idea of being a rebel talent?
As I was in the pre-COVID world, I was traveling a lot talking about the book. One of the questions that I received a lot is exactly this question. What about gender differences? Is it harder for women to break the rules? And the answer is often surprising. In fact, I ended up writing a blog for Harvard Business Review to talk about this very topic. The answer is that we believe that women are going to have a harder time, that it's easier for men to break rules. We also believe, both men and women, that if we break the rules constructively, men benefits and women don't, or at least not to the same extent. But that's not what I see in my research. To the extent to which there are these ingredients coming through, and there is in fact perspective, and there is this sense of coming in as a positive, constructive rebel, then the benefits in terms of experiencing more engagement with the work that you do, higher levels of performance, more creativity, more innovative ways of thinking, are equal for men and women, which I think is surprising.
That is, and it's very reassuring. So thank you for sharing that. That's great, Francesca. And another question actually came in from Kristen, and she was curious definitionally. You use the term rebel. She wants to know there's an often used, sometimes overused term in the corporate world of contrarian. Is a rebel the same thing as a contrarian, or is it actually a little bit different? How do you think about that?
So, contrarian to me is all about bringing up barriers to situations where the barriers do not make the discussions more constructive or more interesting. So, when I think of contrarian, I think of those people who fundamentally break rules just for the sake of breaking rules, slow us down just for the sake of slowing us down, present a different argument just for the sake of presenting a different argument. And rebels instead are people who break rules that hold them and others back, and they do so in a way that is positive and constructive. I'll give you a quick example. So this again comes from the 3 Michelin star restaurant that I mentioned earlier, Osteria Francescana, but it's a story about the person who works there as a maitre d'. His name is Giuseppe Palmieri. And this is a story of a family of 4 visiting the restaurant on a Friday night. So imagine dad, mom, and 2 boys. One is 13 years old, the other one is 8. They come to the restaurant for their meal, and they're presented with, based on what the fathers wanted, a 13-course tasting menu. And like, just close your eyes and picture these dishes. They're very sophisticated, but they involve foie gras, they involve eel. So not the type of dishes that growing boys would hunger for. And the dad was so excited to eat at the restaurant that he also made the reservations for Saturday night. So it's now 24 hours later, same family back at the restaurant. And again, just imagine being that kid, being dragged by your parents, doing something that you clearly don't want to do. Once again, Palmieri shows up, asks for the order, and this time the father goes for a 10-course tasting menu. And one of the dishes is a soup that actually has nails at the bottom of the plate. Again,
That
these
just sounds
dishes are
dangerous.
delicious, but if you're an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old, you might not see the sophistication and the beauty in what you're putting into your stomach. And when Palmieri took the order, you noticed this face of great desperation in the 2 boys. And so he turned to the 8-year-old and said, "What would you like to have?" No hesitation, "Pizza." That's what the 8-year-old screamed. Now, person who's just doing their job would have maybe smiled and then just brought the meal. But Palmieri did not. He actually excused himself, ran to the phone, called up the best pizzeria in town, and ordered the pizza, which arrived 15 minutes later. That is what constructive rebels are all about. They just don't follow the rules or the script. They think more broadly about the mission and how do I deliver on it in a way that is creative when I see obstacles coming my way. And so I think of rebels like Palmieri, and I feel inspired to embrace the same type of mindset.
Love that, Francesca. And in fact, you have clearly one of your pre-existing fans here, Daniela, says this was one of my favorite stories in the book. So yes,
Mine
yes.
too, mine too.
That's awesome. We love that. So Barbara in Slovenia has a question for you, Francesca. She is curious. She wants to know, much like we have just sort of leading by example, she wants to know, if you're a rebel, if you're sort of a rebel by example, what impact does that have on the rest of the company? Does it make it easier for other people to be rebels, or how does it change the corporate culture if you are a rebel and you're relatively senior?
Being a rebel is incredibly contagious. And in fact, even if you think about these very different talents that rebels seems to share, the power of role modeling is so important. The one that comes to mind to me, since I've been looking at a lot of the data on this very talent, is curiosity. Now, we're all born with it, but as it turns out, it disappears as we grow older, which I think is a very sad finding. It raises all sorts of questions about how often we stop asking questions, even when we're really curious about them, because we fear judgment. And who taught us to do just that? And how is it that we can embrace this wonderful way of being in the world that we had when we were little kids? Well, rebels have that, and they role model this inquisitiveness, asking the questions. You're in a discussion and you're the first to ask, but what if we were to look at this differently? Or why is it that we're truly deciding to go down this path? And so that question asking can be truly, truly powerful. And so absolutely, for the rebels out there, you are doing amazing in creating environments where others feel more of the courage to do the same, since it does require courage to bring these talents forward.
Fantastic, Francesca. That's great. And just as a reminder to all of you, if you want to make sure you never miss one of our Newsweek weekly sessions on Thursday, you can go to my website, dorieclark.com, sign up for a free self-assessment, and you will be added to the email list. So you will get notifications about these great conversations. And next week, we are having on the 18th of March, Aubrey Marcus, who is the founder of a well-known supplements company and the author of the book Own It. So we look forward to that. And of course, you can find out more about Francesca Gino and her book, Rebel Talent, at francescagino.com. So Francesca, a very interesting question came in from Sheetal, and she wants to know, how can rebels flourish in areas like human resources where there's a lot of policy restrictions? If you feel like your hands are being tied by your corporate environment, are there still ways you can be a rebel? What does that look like?
I would think very carefully about who are the people you have direct influence over. Now, when I think about people who feel restricted by their environment, one of the leaders who comes to mind is a leader in an organization that is heavily regulated. The culture is all about do not rock the boat, follow the chain of command. And it's also highly hierarchical and bureaucratic. So this is a leader in a group here in the United States in the Air Force. It's called Squadron 99. Most of them are pilots who fly spy planes. So they go 70,000 feet above the ground to take pictures for intelligence that are used in other parts of the government. But when he came to be the leader of that squadron, he came in and said, look, our mission is to be combat ready. And if we want to achieve that mission, we need to think differently. We truly need to be curious. We truly need to broaden perspective and really embrace these ideas. And if you look at the number of innovations that came out of that group in the last 3 or 4 years, it's truly impressive. They now do contracting contracting in the private sector rather than in the public sector. Or they have apps that they've developed that help with safety during flights. And what's interesting is that one of the first things that he told his squadron was go study regulations. Now, the reason why I love him is that he was definitely in a very constrained environment. But he didn't sit and wait for others to remove constraints or to change things for him. He understood his span of control, and that is where he took actions. So I think that to questions like this one, that's the story to feel inspired by. Think about where your Squadron 99 is and start there. And what's beautiful about this story is that in the past few years, many people coming and knocking on his door to try to understand what he's doing so successfully. And so it's a very much a bottom-up type of approach, but very inspiring one in a context that is in fact very constrained.
I love that example, Francesca. Thank you for sharing that. And so Aletta had a sort of related question, which is if you are trying to make the case to your boss or to the higher ups in an organization about why rebelliousness or rebellious behavior is actually a good thing, how do you make that argument most effectively? Are there aspects that you could highlight that perhaps would be more persuasive than others, or how would you go about making that case?
So in today's environment, the argument in a sense is easy, because if you look at constructive rebels, there are people who are much more agile. And when it comes to changing with the environment that is changing around you, they're much more able to quickly adapt. So yes, there are people who are quite innovative and creative and stay curious. And thanks to that, they're much better able and faster to change. So that would be my argument, probably the one that I would choose in the type of world that we live in today. But I also want to say that part of the reason why you get to greater agility, more easiness to change, more innovation is because being a rebel fundamentally engages us differently with the job that we have and with the colleagues we're doing the work with. And we've all seen the data across the globe about engagement, and it's pretty disappointing to see how often people find their jobs to not be a source of joy, but to be a source of frustration. And so sometimes the arguments that wins for allowing for greater rebelliousness is to say, look, if we allow for this to happen, people are going to thrive at work. And given how much we spend at work, isn't that a good goal to have?
I think that's pretty powerful. And of course, I'd be remiss, as we're just hitting the year anniversary of the pandemic. I'm curious, Francesca, how do you feel that COVID and all of its attendant developments have shaped our relationship to Rebel talent? Has this made things easier for Rebels or harder? What does it mean to be a Rebel in a work from home or a virtual environment?
So the easy part of answering his question is to say that people who embrace their inner rebels, they clearly thrived better over the last year throughout the pandemic. And part of the reason is that if we look at some of the data on engagement across the globe, or engagement even just here in the United States, at least in the data that my colleagues and I collected, you actually see a decline in a lot of organizations. But what helps buffer against that decline is having a more of a mindset that focuses on the opportunity rather than the constraints. And being curious allow for that mindset to exist. And so people who embrace their curiosity, who embrace seeing the opportunity within the constraints, fared better. Or going to another problems that has affected a lot of us and a lot of organizations across the globe during the pandemic. If you look at fatigue or burnout, clearly skyrocketed over the last year for all sorts of good reasons and understandable reasons. But when people retain their curiosity, which is a major fuel of the rebels, they were able to lower their stress or make sure that the stress was not paralyzing, but was enhancing their motivation to think differently. And so the rebel have fared much, much better in the last year.
Yeah, it's such an interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that. And it certainly is a hopeful sign for people who are harnessing their inner rebel. So we probably have time, Francesca, for just one more question. And as a reminder, Francesca's book is Rebel Talent. You can find out more at francescagino.com, and you can find out more about my work and sign up to get updates about these very conversations at dorieclark.com. And so, Francesca, the final question that I wanted to go to is from Daniela. If you are a leader in an organization, if you say, okay, I've listened to Francesca's interview, I buy it, this sounds great. What is it that you can do as a leader to make sure that you are encouraging these behaviors, that you are not, somehow without your knowledge, engaging in soul crushing of your employees? How can you cultivate the rebel spirit in your own organization? What would you say?
I would say be like a pirate. And here's what I mean by this. As I was working on the book, I went to all sorts of interesting organizations across the globe, but also organization in history. And one such organization was pirate ships in the 16th century. Two reasons why they're fascinating. There are many, but I'll list two that I think help us answer this question. One is that at a time when it was about 200 years before slavery ended in the United States, they were the most diverse organization on the planet. So just for that, I think they're quite interesting. They were hiring people to be part of the crew, not because of race or gender, but truly because of their skills and commitment to the mission of the organization. But they were also interesting for the way they were organized. So the crew was in charge of choosing the captain. And the crew, through very simple mechanisms, could remove the captain if the captain was not behaving well towards the crew, in the way they shared the booties, in the way they treated them. And to me, that really raised an interesting question that I think we would be better off asking on a day-to-day basis in our own way of being leaders. And the question is, am I the type of captain that my crew would choose as his leader today? And I think if we ask that question, we're going to be very much centered to thinking, am I creating the conditions where people bring out curiosity? Am I role modeling this behavior for others? Am I embracing novelty? Am I asking questions to others in a way that broaden our perspective rather than just being there to give answers? So I would say be more like a pirate.
That is fantastic. You heard it here, folks. Harvard Business School professor Francesca Gino says, be more like a pirate. That is your advice for today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please hit the like button and hit the share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it. Francesca Gino, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was such a pleasure, Dorie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.